You're watching the News Grid Roundtable. Our focus today is on the South African media and bias. Should we all, as media houses, own our political and other ideological leanings? I'm joined by Sbu Ngalwa. He's the South African National Editors Forum chairperson, News 24 politics editor Qaanitah, and Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird are all my guests. And Sbu, I want us to pick up on the issue that Qaanitah was mentioning around media policy. How often is that updated in this country? Because the media landscape is itself changing, and often there's a sense that the rules of the game aren't adapting fast enough.
I think here, Thembekile, you're talking about the press code in the case of print media, online publications, and also blogs, and the BCCA in terms of broadcasters. In terms of the press code, look, the press code has been updated. I think the recent update was actually around the beginning of the year, and that is actually what is our guiding light as journalists, particularly those who are in print, to understand that these are the parameters within which we report on, and understanding that it calls on all of us to not only be fair and balanced, but to also make sure that we do not deliberately distort facts to prove certain narratives. And I think the other point that we always conflate is that there is legitimate questions that are asked about bias in the media, but there is also criticism. We must distinguish between that and the cynicism and blanket criticism that just says, you, the media, you are just pushing a particular agenda, because that is different, totally different from legitimate questions about implicit biases among journalists. I think those are always sometimes driven mostly by political parties, not only in this country. It's the same thing elsewhere, including in the United States. But at any given time, owning those biases and understanding those biases and being guided by journalistic standards to always be fair and accurate, that is what will make sure that we are able to minimize that bias.
On that then, William Bird, let me ask you, do you think there is a deliberate attempt by the political elite in the country to indeed dent or undo public trust and confidence in the South African media?
So I think that some of their members of some political parties definitely do that. They tend to be often quite short-sighted, and they seem to think that if you can undermine the credibility of the media house that is reporting on, for example, a particular scandal, that will then somehow get viewers or the readers of that publication to then think, oh, okay, well, they're just lying, or they just make it up, or they've been told to write it by illegal forces somewhere in the ether, So there is often a response by political parties to a scandal being, breaking, is to then go on attack and say, oh, but the media didn't do this, or they're lying, or it's all a subject of something else, So they do that. What, of course, they forget is that when they undermine one media entity, they're undermining all the media entities. And in fact, the media suffer the same challenge, because when one of our media messes up, and they do mess up, on a number of occasions, they don't only undermine the credibility of that media house, they undermine the credibility of the media more broadly. And so it gives then, those political parties a lot of ammunition to then say, oh, you see, they messed that up, they didn't do that. So, like the Sunday Times, when they got that story wrong, you see all of the media, they just make things up. Or they did this, all of the media are therefore like that. So it's a very useful tool for political parties to use to attack media's credibility, especially if they are exposing them for a number of things, and usually it's wrongdoing.
Qaanitah, the politics of media owners at an individual or business level also are often used to color the reporting of a publication, a TV or radio station. Is there too much involvement at the top of the companies that own newspapers, television stations and radio stations?
I think, it's a generalization that we should warn against. It may be different for different media houses, and what's important is that we not only, just make that broad generalization, but also sort of identify case by case. And so there are some media companies where there is ownership, questions around ownership and interference, and we can see it and we can document it. And then there are other instances where there is just this purported bias or this purported influence that can't really be justified. I think that any editor worth his or her salt will not allow the ownership structure or corporate management to play a role in the editorial sort of direction that they would be taking. But more importantly, I think that it would be really amiss to not consider that it could be an issue in journalistic decisions. You know what's unfolding in the State Capture Commission, and how, for example, the New Age was used partially for a particular narrative in the past. You see similar accusations made around the independent media group by some ministers, as soon as last week, for example. And so, yes, it's something that's absolutely important. I think it needs to be analyzed factually and fairly on a case-by-case basis. And I do think that editors have to guard against any commercial influence, because if anything, it just sows distrust. And all we have, our currency as journalists, is trust from the public.
So let me get the view from you then, because media companies often are owned by people who aren't journalists. They have commercial and other interests. As an editors' forum, do you worry at all about how that sometimes filters through into news reporting and the other content?
Of course, Thembekile, I mean, the reality is that we all understand the powerful effect of the media as agenda-setting medium. And you would know that media owners are not necessarily people who own these companies because they are proponents of media freedom. I think most times you understand that they understand the inherent power and influence that comes with media ownership. So it is always important, as Qaanitah says, to try and keep that wall there between the commercial interests and the editorial and journalistic imperatives of companies. But the reality is, though, that in as much as you want to do that, most media companies are under pressure. And you sometimes find that the commercial interests, or you find that there's the creeping in of that element into the editorial space. So it is always important that we guard against that. And I think the other point that is important here, Thembekile, is what William was talking about, some of the ethical breaches that we've seen in some of the newspapers. Now, it is that kind of behavior and reporting that gives rise to that mistrust that exists between ourselves as the media and the public. I think, and it is also for that reason why SANEF instituted the media ethics inquiry that is headed by retired Judge Kathleen Setchwell, because we do understand the damage that has been done to the industry, where any reader or viewer out there looks at us as one block, in that look at what you've all done, you've all contributed to state capture. So I think what is important for us is to try and claw back some of that trust and win back some of that trust. It will not be an easy one. It's not going to be an overnight project, but what is important is that once that report comes out at the end of this month, looking into ethical breaches in newsrooms, we must be able then to have a conference as the South African media to say, how do we move forward? How do we implement some of these recommendations? But more importantly, how do we ensure that what happened around the state capture and the destructive narrative of a SARS rogue unit, how can we avoid that going forward?
And William, just on that, there is definitely a healing that needs to happen between the politicians in this country, the political parties, and some media houses. Not to say, of course, that journalists and political parties have to sing from the same hymn sheet, not at all. There is, just this week, we saw the example of our reporter Nobesuthu Hechana being abused by members of the EFF in the Western Cape. Yeah. On the weekend, we saw, again, the tension between independent and the office of the Minister Pravin Gordhan playing out on Twitter, for example. How do you even begin to take those issues and get them to a point where the parties aren't best friends because that's not a requirement of the job, but everyone is able to do their work with mutual respect and afford each other the space to do the critical work of being a political party and indeed being a media house that goes about reporting truthfully, factually, and without fear?
Well, I mean, I think you've just partly answered it by saying that's what they need to do. So from a media perspective, they need to make sure that they adhere to the ethical codes and things like the press code and their own internal editorial policies. And political parties need to play by the same rules. You know, you can't have people resorting to violence because they don't like the slant that eNCA takes. If they don't like the slant that eNCA takes, complain to the BCCSA. If you're not happy with that, take them to court if you believe so. If you're still not happy with that, try and engage with them, talk to them about it, present to them evidence, say, you know, we looked at 2,000 news stories over a year, and we believe that in all of them the EFF always looks bad, or we believe that the ANC always looks, you know, good, or whatever. Like, present evidence and then engage with the media house, because otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. Because what those kinds of conflicts do is they undermine that very basis of that relationship to begin with. So the moment you resort to violence in that particular relationship, you're not just undermining the media's and preventing the media's ability to report and do their job. You're undermining the very democratic system that puts you in power to begin with. Mm. So if you're not interested in a democratic space and a democratic system, then that's fine. Then you can go for anarchy and whatever else. But that's not the democracy that people have signed up for. It's not what's in our constitution. If people don't like that, then as a nation we have to say we're going to go for a dictatorship or whatever, right? I mean, those times you don't get a choice in that. But we are living in a constitutional democracy. So it's important that people respect those things and understand that if you violate media's freedom, you're undermining all of the other rights as well.
Qaanitah, I want to get your thoughts then on media bans, political parties saying we won't speak to a particular channel, a particular newspaper, and then vice versa, a channel or a newspaper title saying we won't cover party X. Is that effective?
Not at all, and I think that it's something that needs to be condemned regardless of who the media organization is and regardless of who the minister or political person or entity is. We should have condemned this when it happened to ANN7 back in the day, regardless of what the allegations floating around it were. It is anti-democratic, and it is anti-freedom of the media for politicians and political parties to ban newspaper organizations or media houses. And so I think it's something that needs to be condemned, and then the same needs to be done around coverage of political parties and political players, because our interest, and we forget this often, that we have a public interest, and we are not reporting for ourselves. We are reporting for the public and for the public good. And so every decision that we take has to be weighed in on public interest. And so what public interest will there be in sort of giving into an ego because, you know, you were criticized by a certain political player, therefore you shouldn't cover that particular event, or and I think there's obviously room for conversation around, you know, when there's threats of violence, for example, when there is violence or real harassment, as we saw this week. But I do think on principle that the bans of media organizations is just a relic of a very, very bad past that we come from, and media organizations banning coverage or withholding coverage of certain political players and parties just feeds into that narrative that the media is biased. And then what happens is, when you spoil the name of one, you spoil the name of all, and we squander the little trust we have from the public.
Okay. Sbu Ngalwa, very quickly in 30 seconds. The media this week has, in response to what happened with Nobesutu and the EFF in the Western Cape, people saying, well, actually, some journalists, in fact, saying, well, we're not going to speak up because when ANN7 reporters were harassed and abused, the media industry looked away because they didn't like the direction that the owners were taking. How are you as an editors forum making sure that those inconsistencies and hypocrisy aren't repeated going forward?
Look, I think there will be instances where there are some errors that are made, or where we may not have reacted in one way or the other to please everyone. But the reality is that even at the time, I've had actually taken time to go back and look at what decisions SANEF has taken previously, and I've actually come across a number of statements and comments that have been made by SANEF, particularly in relation to ANN7. I think there was the issue of the firing of 8 journalists from ANN7, where we spoke out against that. And there have been other instances, including when Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF, banned ANN7 from their events. I think looking at that, and what happened to Nobesuthu, and also if perhaps we may have not have been quite vociferous in the past, it does not mean that we cannot speak now just because it did not happen at a rate or a speed at which one may have expected. The reality is the political parties that are represented in Parliament, those political parties sign up to the Constitution of this country, and they take an oath. And that Constitution, Section 16 of Section 16 guarantees freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press. And also, in terms of the complaint we have made to Parliament in the case of Nobesuthu, it actually has to do with the justification of assault or harassment by a member of Parliament, where he says that just, she had not been pushed, therefore that means it is not harassment. She was just pushed slightly. So the danger there is that there's a parliamentary ethics code which says that members of Parliament at all occasions, they have to act in accordance with the public trust that is placed in them. That was the underlying phrase or line, which also is what sank Andile Lungisa in his appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeals, where he was found not to have acted in that instance, in that manner.
Sbu Ngalwa, chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, Qaanitah Hunter, politics editor at News 24, William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. Thank you all for that conversation. The News Grid Roundtable, our last for this week, focusing on South African media and the bias to declare or not to declare. That's my lot with you for the week.